My name is Samuel Kraus, and for 38 years I have lived alone on my cattle ranch in the Arizona Territory, watching the world change around me while I remained stubbornly the same. The year was 1887, and the frontier was slowly giving way to civilization, railroads, telegraph lines, and government officials who thought they knew better than the people who had been living on this land for generations. I'd built my ranch from nothing, carved it out of the desert with my own hands, and the sweat of my brow. 2,000 acres of hard-won land where I raised cattle and horses, living by my own rules and answering to no one. I'd never married, never had children, and had convinced myself I preferred the solitude. The desert was my companion, the wind my conversation partner, and the endless sky my cathedral. But on that scorching August morning, everything changed when I rode into the town of Copper Creek for supplies and witnessed something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The town square was crowded with people, more than I'd ever seen gathered in one place. Men in suits and women in their finest dresses stood in a circle around something or someone that I couldn't see from my position on horseback. The murmur of voices carried an ugly undertone, the kind of sound a mob makes when it's working itself up to something terrible. I dismounted and pushed through the crowd, my height and broad shoulders clearing a path until I reached the center of the circle. What I saw there made my blood run cold. A young Apache woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, sat on the ground with her hands bound behind her back. Her long black hair hung in tangles around her face, and her traditional dress was torn and dirty. But it was her eyes that struck me most, dark as midnight and filled with a defiance that burned like fire, even in the face of whatever humiliation was being heaped upon her. Standing over her was Judge Harrison Whitmore, a pompous man in his 50s who'd been appointed by the territorial government to bring order to our region. He held a piece of paper in his hands and was reading from it in a voice loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, he declared, I hereby declare this Apache woman, known as Aiyana, to be unfit for civilized society. She has repeatedly refused to conform to Christian values, has shown violent tendencies toward her appointed guardians, and has demonstrated an inability to adapt to proper domestic duties. The crowd murmured its approval, and I felt sick to my stomach. I'd heard about these fitness hearings, kangaroo courts designed to strip Native Americans of their rights and justify shipping them off to distant reservations where they could be forgotten. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, she has been found guilty of assault against Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, her assigned guardian, and of destroying property belonging to the Hartwell household. The punishment for these crimes, combined with her obvious unfitness for civilized life, is immediate transport to the San Carlos Reservation, where she will remain under military supervision. I looked at the young woman Aiyana and saw her jaw clench at the judge's words. There was no fear in her expression, only rage and a kind of proud resignation that told me she'd rather die than submit to this farce. Now then, Judge Whitmore said, folding his paper with satisfaction, are there any objections to this ruling? The crowd was silent. These people, my neighbors, were content to watch as this young woman was railroaded into a life of imprisonment, simply because she refused to abandon her heritage and become what they wanted her to be. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have minded my own business, collected my supplies, and ridden back to my ranch. But something about the fire in Aiyana's eyes, something about the injustice of the whole proceeding, made me step forward. I object, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the square. Every head turned toward me, and I could feel the weight of their stares. Judge Whitmore's face flushed red with annoyance. Mr. Cross, he said through gritted teeth, this is a legal proceeding. You have no standing to object. I have standing as a citizen of this territory, I replied, stepping closer to where Aiyana sat, and I'm exercising my right to speak. What possible objection could you have? Mrs. Hartwell spoke up from the crowd. She was a thin, sharp-faced woman who ran the local boarding house and had apparently been appointed as Aiyana's guardian. This savage attacked me. She destroyed my property. She's completely unfit for civilized society. I looked down at Aiyana, and for the first time she looked back at me. There was suspicion in her gaze, but also a flicker of something else, hope, perhaps, or simply curiosity about why a white man would speak up for her. What did she do, exactly? I asked Mrs. Hartwell. She refused to wear proper clothing. She wouldn't attend church services. She spoke that heathen language of hers instead of English, and when I tried to correct her behavior with appropriate discipline, she fought back like a wild animal. I could read between the lines. Mrs. Hartwell had tried to strip this young woman of everything that made her who she was, and when Aiyana had resisted, she'd been labeled violent and unfit. Judge Whitmore, I said, turning to face the pompous official, what if I were to offer an alternative to sending her to the reservation? The judge's eyes narrowed. What kind of alternative? What if I were to take responsibility for her, offer her employment on my ranch, give her a chance to prove that she can be a productive member of society without abandoning her heritage? The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Hartwell looked scandalized, and several of the men began shouting objections. That's preposterous, Judge Whitmore sputtered. You can't just— Why not? I interrupted. You said she was unfit for civilized society. While my ranch isn't exactly civilized society, it's hard work, honest work, and if she's willing to do it, I'm willing to give her the chance. I looked down at Aiyana again, and this time, I addressed her directly. What do you say? Would you rather come work on my ranch, or go to the reservation? For a long moment, she just stared at me, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and strong, with only the slightest trace of an accent. Why would you do this for me? It was a fair question, and one I wasn't entirely sure I could answer, because everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves on their own terms. Aiyana studied my face for another moment, then nodded slowly. I will work for you. Judge Whitmore looked like he'd swallowed a toad. This is highly irregular. I can't simply, actually, you can. Interrupted a new voice from the crowd. Dr. Marcus Webb, the town's physician and one of the few educated men I respected, stepped forward. Territorial law allows for alternative arrangements in cases like this, provided the individual in question has a sponsor willing to take legal responsibility for their actions. The judge glared at Dr. Webb, clearly unhappy at having his authority challenged by someone who actually knew the law. And you support this ... arrangement? I do, Dr. Webb said firmly. I've had occasion to interact with this young woman during her time in town, and I can attest that she's intelligent, capable, and far from the savage Mrs. Hartwell has portrayed her to be. More murmurs from the crowd, but now they seemed less certain, less unified in their condemnation. Judge Whitmore looked around, clearly realizing that his easy victory was slipping away. Very well, he said finally, his voice tight with frustration. Mr. Cross, if you're willing to take legal responsibility for this woman's actions, I'll allow the arrangement. But understand, if she causes any trouble at all, she'll be shipped to San Carlos immediately, and you'll face charges. As well. Understood, I said, then knelt down to untie the ropes binding Aiyana's hands. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the rough hemp had chafed her skin, and I felt another surge of anger at the treatment she'd received. As I helped her to her feet, she swayed slightly, and I realized she was probably dehydrated and exhausted. How long had they kept her tied up in this heat? Can you ride? I asked quietly. She nodded. Though I could see the effort it took for her to remain upright, the crowd began to disperse, most of them muttering their disapproval of the judge's decision. Mrs. Hartwell pushed through the people to confront me. Directly, you're making a terrible mistake, Samuel Cross, she hissed. That girl is dangerous. She's violent and unpredictable, and she'll turn on you the first chance she gets. I'll take that risk, I replied calmly. Don't come crying to me when you wake up with a knife in your back, she snapped, then stalked away. Dr. Webb approached as I was helping Aiyana toward my horse. Samuel, I think you've done a good thing here today, but Mrs. Hartwell isn't entirely wrong. This won't be easy. There are people in this town who won't be happy about your decision. There are people in this town who aren't happy about a lot of things, I said. That's never stopped me from doing what I think is right. Dr. Webb smiled. No, I suppose it hasn't. If you need anything, medical attention, legal advice, whatever, you know where to find me. I thanked him and turned my attention back to Aiyana. She was standing beside my horse, one hand resting on the saddle, her face pale but determined. Have you eaten today? I asked. She shook her head. When did you last have water? Yesterday morning, I cursed under my breath and handed her my canteen. She drank deeply, and I could see some color returning to her cheeks. We'll get you some food once we're out of town, I said. Can you manage to ride behind me, or do you need to rest? First, I can ride, she said, and I believed her. There was a strength in this young woman that went beyond the physical, a core of steel that all the Mrs. Hartwells in the world couldn't break. I helped her up behind me, and we rode out of Copper Creek under the watchful eyes of half the town. I could feel their stares boring into my back, could almost hear their whispered conversations about the crazy rancher who'd taken in an Apache savage. Let them talk. I'd been the subject of their gossip before, and I'd survived it just fine. As we rode through the desert toward my ranch, I found myself wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I knew nothing about this young woman, except that she'd been judged unfit by people whose opinions I didn't respect. I didn't know if she could really work on a ranch, if she'd try to run away at the first opportunity, or if Mrs. Hartwell had been right about her being dangerous. But I did know one thing. She deserved better than what she'd been getting, and if I could give her that chance, maybe I could prove that the judgment of others wasn't always right. The ride to my ranch took 2 hours, and during that time, Aiyana didn't say a word. I could feel her behind me, alert and watchful, taking in every detail of the landscape we passed through. When we finally crested the hill that overlooked my property, I heard her draw in a sharp breath. It's beautiful, she said softly, and I felt a surge of pride. My ranch spread out below us like a green oasis in the desert. The main house was built of adobe and timber, with a wide porch that faced the mountains. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and I could see my cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. This is home, I said simply. As we rode down the hill toward the house, I caught sight of my foreman, Miguel Santos, emerging from the barn. Miguel was a Mexican man in his 50s who'd been working for me for over a decade. He was one of the few people I trusted completely, and I knew I'd need his support if this arrangement was going to work. Miguel's eyes widened when he saw Aiyana, but to his credit, he didn't say anything beyond a polite greeting. I'd tell him the whole story later, when we had privacy. I helped Aiyana down from the horse and led her toward the house. She moved stiffly, clearly exhausted, but her head was held high, and her eyes were alert, taking in every detail of her new surroundings. "Are you hungry?" I asked as we reached the porch. She nodded, and I realized it was probably the first time anyone had asked her that question in days. "Come on then," I said, opening the door to my house. "Let's get you fed and cleaned up. Tomorrow we can talk about work. Tonight, you're a guest." As Aiyana stepped across the threshold of my home, I had the strangest feeling that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. The townspeople had called her unfit, but looking at her now tired, hungry, but unbroken eyes saw something entirely different. I saw potential. I saw strength. I saw a young woman who'd been judged by people who didn't understand her, and I was determined to prove them wrong. The first week with Aiyana on my ranch was like trying to gentle a wild Mustang. Every interaction required patience, careful movements, and a healthy respect for the fact that she could bolt at any moment. She'd accepted my offer of work, but trust was something that would have to be earned, not given. I'd set her up in the small cabin that had once housed my previous foreman, a sturdy building with its own fireplace and a view of the mountains. It was private enough to give her space, but close enough to the main house that she could reach me if she needed help. The first morning, I'd knocked on her door at dawn to begin showing her around the ranch, but there was no answer. I found her sitting on a rock outcropping about a quarter-mile from the house, facing east toward the rising sun. She was completely still, her eyes closed, her lips moving silently in what I assumed was prayer or meditation. I watched from a distance, not wanting to interrupt, until she opened her eyes and turned to look at me. "I was greeting the sun," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "It's a good way to start the day," I replied, and I meant it. There was something peaceful about the ritual, something that spoke to a connection with the land that I understood. Even if I practiced it differently, she stood and walked back toward me, and I noticed she moved with a fluid grace that spoke of someone completely comfortable in the natural world. Her feet seemed to find the surest path without conscious thought, and she avoided stepping on the small desert flowers that dotted the landscape. "What would you like me to do?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it carried weight. She wasn't asking what I expected her to do, or what Mrs. Hartwell had demanded of her. She was asking what I wanted from her, and I could hear the wariness in her voice. "First, I'd like you to meet the animals," I said. "A ranch is only as good as the relationship between the people and the livestock. If the animals don't trust you, the work becomes 10 times harder." I led her to the horse corral first, where my 6 horses were gathered around the water trough. They looked up as we approached, ears pricked forward with curiosity. "This is Luna," I said, pointing to a gray mare who was clearly the leader of the group. "She's smart as a whip and twice as stubborn. If you can win her over, the others will. Follow." Aiyana approached the fence slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Luna watched her with intelligent eyes, then stepped closer to investigate. To my surprise, the mare allowed Aiyana to touch her nose through the fence rails. That usually took weeks of patient work with new people. "She likes you," I observed. "Animals know when someone understands them," Aiyana replied, continuing to stroke Luna's nose. "They can sense fear, anger, deception, but they also sense respect." Over the next hour, I watched as Aiyana interacted with each of my horses. She had an intuitive understanding of their individual personalities, which ones were bold, which were shy, which needed gentle encouragement, and which responded to confident leadership. It was clear she'd grown up around horses, and good ones. At that, "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" I asked as we moved on to check the cattle. "My father was known for his horses," she said, and I heard the past tense. "He said that to truly ride, you must become part of the horse, not its master." The white soldiers never understood this. They tried to break the spirit of our horses. Just as they tried to break our spirits, there was pain in her voice, old and deep, and I didn't push for more details. Instead, I showed her the cattle, explaining how we rotated them between pastures, how to spot signs of illness or injury, and how to read the weather patterns that determined when to move the herd to shelter.ai. Aiyana absorbed everything with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge meant survival. She asked intelligent questions and made observations that showed she was thinking beyond just the immediate task at hand. "The grass is thin in the south pasture," she noted as we rode through it. "Too many cattle, not enough rain." She was right. I'd been planning to move that section of the herd, but I was impressed that she'd noticed the problem so quickly. "What would you do about it?" I asked. "Move half the cattle to the north pasture. Let this land rest until the autumn rains come. The earth needs time to heal, just like people do." It was exactly what I'd been planning to do, but hearing it from her confirmed that she understood the deeper principles of ranching, not just the surface tasks. That afternoon, I introduced her to Miguel, who had been watching our interactions with careful interest. Miguel was a good judge of character, and I valued his opinion. "Miguel, this is Aiyana," I said in Spanish. then switched to English. She'll be working with us. Miguel nodded respectfully. Welcome, señorita. I hope you'll be happy here. Thank you, Aiyana replied, also in Spanish, which surprised both of us. I hope to learn much from you. Miguel's eyebrows rose, and he shot me a look that clearly said, this one is full of surprises. Over the following days, I began to see just how many surprises Aiyana had in store. She could track animals across terrain that looked empty to me, finding signs in bent grass and disturbed soil that told stories I couldn't read. She knew which plants could be used for medicine and which were poisonous to livestock. She could predict weather changes hours before they arrived, reading signs in the wind and the behavior of birds. But it was her way with the animals that truly impressed me. The horses followed her around like devoted dogs, and even the cattle seemed calmer. When she was near, she had a gift that couldn't be taught, only recognized and respected. How do you do it? I asked one evening, as we sat on the porch after a long day of work. We'd been moving cattle to a new pasture, and what should have been a difficult job had gone smoothly because the animals seemed to trust her instinctively. What? She asked, though I could tell she knew what I meant. The animals, they respond to you like you're speaking their language. Aiyana was quiet for a moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains. When she spoke, her voice was soft and thoughtful. My grandmother taught me that all living things are connected. The horse, the cow, the eagle, the snakeweed are all part of the same web of life. When you understand this, truly understand it, you can feel what they feel, know what they need, and the white world doesn't see it that way. Her laugh was bitter. The white world sees animals as property, as things to be used and discarded. They see the land the same way, something to be conquered and consumed, not something to live in harmony with. I thought about that as we sat in comfortable silence. She wasn't wrong. Most of the ranchers I knew saw their livestock as walking dollar signs, nothing more. They'd work an animal to death if it meant higher profits, and they'd strip the land bare if it gave them a short-term advantage. Is that why you fought back? I asked against Mrs. Hartwell and the others. Aiyana's jaw tightened. They wanted to make me into something I am not. They cut my hair, burned my clothes, forbade me to speak my own language. They said my beliefs were savage, that my ancestors were heathens who needed to be forgotten. What did you do? I refused. I spoke Apache whenever they weren't listening. I prayed to my ancestors in the old way. I wore my hair long when they weren't watching. She turned to look at me, and I could see the fire that had burned in her eyes that day in the town square. When Mrs. Hartwell tried to beat me for speaking my grandmother's name, I fought back. Good for you, I said, and I meant it. Surprised you don't think I was wrong. I think you were defending something precious. I think anyone who tried to strip away everything that makes you who you are deserved whatever they got. For the first time since she'd arrived, Aiyana smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. You are not like the others. No, I agreed. I suppose I'm not. As the days turned into weeks, we fell into a comfortable routine. Aiyana proved to be one of the best workers I'd ever had, strong, intelligent, and completely reliable. She never complained about the long hours or the physical demands of ranch work, and she brought a perspective to the job that I'd never considered. She taught me to read the land the way her people had for generations, to see patterns and connections that weren't obvious to someone raised in the white world. Under her guidance, I began to understand my ranch not as a collection of separate resources to be managed, but as a living system where every element affected every other element. The creek is running lower this year, she observed one morning. As we checked the water levels, the cottonwoods are stressed, and the grass near the banks is dying. It's been a dry summer, I said. Yes, but there's more. Look at the beaver dam upstream, it's been abandoned. Without the beavers to slow the water and create pools, the creek runs too fast. The water doesn't have time to soak into the ground. She was right again. I'd noticed the abandoned dam but hadn't connected it to the dropping water levels downstream. What can we do about it? I asked. We could build our own dam, or we could encourage the beavers to return. They left because someone was trapping them. Stop the trapping, and they'll come back. It was a longer-term solution than most ranchers would consider, but it made sense. Work with the natural systems instead of against them, and everyone benefited. But it wasn't just her knowledge that impressed MIT, was her character. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the way she'd been treated by the white world, she showed no bitterness toward me. She worked hard, kept her word, and slowly began to trust that I meant what I said about giving her a fair chance. The real test came at the end of her first month, when we had to drive a herd of cattle to the railroad depot in Tucson. It was a 3-day journey through difficult terrain, and I needed someone I could rely on completely. I want you to come with me, I told her. Miguel will stay here to watch the ranch. She looked surprised. You trust me that much? I trust your abilities, I said, and I trust your word. You said you'd work for me, and you've kept that promise every day since you've been here. The cattle drive went better than I'd dared hope. Aiyana's skill with the animals made the job easier, and her knowledge of the terrain helped us avoid several potential problems. When we reached Tucson, the cattle broker was impressed with the condition of the herd. Best-looking cattle I've seen all season. Cross, he said as he counted out my payment. Whatever you're doing different, keep it up. That night, As we camped under the stars on the way home, Aiyana and I talked more openly than we ever had before. "Why did you really speak up for me that day?" she asked. "In the town square." I thought about it for a while before answering. "Because I recognized something in you. The same thing I see in a Mustang that's been mistreated. Spirit that refuses to be broken. Strength that comes from surviving things that would destroy a weaker soul. And you saw this in a few minutes. I saw it in your eyes. The way you looked. At that judge. At Mrs. Hartwell. At all of them. You weren't afraid. You were angry, and you had every right to be." Aiyana was quiet for a long time, staring up at the stars. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "My father used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who can't. You had nothing to gain by helping me, and everything to lose. Maybe, or maybe I had everything to gain and didn't know it yet." She turned to look at me, and in the firelight, I could see something had changed in her expression. The wariness was still there, but it was tempered now with something else, respect, perhaps, or the beginning of genuine trust. "The townspeople still think you made a mistake," she said. "The townspeople think a lot of things. Most of them are wrong, and if they're right, if I am unfit for their civilized world." I looked at her, this strong, intelligent, capable woman who had proven herself over and over again in the past month. I couldn't help but laugh. "Aiyana," I said, "if you're unfit for their civilized world, then their civilized world isn't worth being fit for." For the second time since I'd known her, she smiled that transformative smile, and for the first time, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was the one who'd been saved that day in the town square. 3 months after Aiyana came to work on my ranch, I realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in how the ranch operated, but in how I saw the world around me. What had started as an act of defiance against the narrow-minded judgment of others had become something much deeper and more meaningful. The change was evident in everything from the health of my livestock to the productivity of my land. Following Aiyana's guidance, we'd implemented practices that worked with natural systems rather than against them. The creek was running stronger thanks to the returning beavers. The grass was thicker because we'd adjusted our grazing patterns, and the cattle were healthier because Aiyana had taught me to recognize and treat ailments, using traditional plant medicines alongside conventional veterinary care. But the most significant change was in me. For 38 years, I'd lived in isolation, convinced that solitude was strength and that depending on others was weakness. Aiyana's presence had shown me the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I was beginning to understand that I'd been the latter for far longer than I'd cared to admit. The revelation came on a crisp October morning when we were working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. I was holding a post steady while Aiyana secured the wire, and I found myself watching the way the morning light caught the blue-black highlights in her hair, the way her hands moved with practiced efficiency, the small frown of concentration that appeared between her eyebrows when she was focused on a task. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her work. "Sorry," I replied, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "I was just thinking." "About what?" It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but simple. I was thinking about how right she looked here, working beside me on land that was becoming as much hers as mine. I was thinking about how empty the ranch had felt before she arrived, and how I couldn't imagine it without her now. I was thinking about feelings I'd convinced myself I was too old and too set in my ways to experience. About how much things have changed, I said finally. She finished securing the wire and straightened up, wiping her hands on her work pants. "Good changes or bad changes?" "Good," I said without hesitation. "Definitely good." She studied my face with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. "The townspeople don't think so. I heard what they said when we went for supplies last week." She was right. Our monthly trip to Copper Creek had been uncomfortable, filled with whispered comments and disapproving stares. The general consensus seemed to be that I'd lost my mind. Taking in an Apache woman and treating her as an equal rather than a servant. "Mrs. Hartwell cornered me by the dry goods," Aiyana continued. "She said I was corrupting you, turning you against your own kind." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that if treating people with respect and dignity was corruption, then perhaps her kind needed more of it." I couldn't help but grin. I bet she loved that. She turned purple and started sputtering about savages and heathens. I think she would have struck me if Dr. Webb hadn't appeared and suggested she might want to lower her voice. Dr. Webb had become an unexpected ally over the past few months, stopping by the ranch occasionally to check on how things were going. He was one of the few people in town who seemed to understand that what I was doing wasn't charity or misguided idealism, but simply recognition of Aiyana's worth as a person. "Samuel," Aiyana said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" "Why haven't you ever married? You're a good man. You have a successful ranch. You're not unpleasant to look at." She paused, and I thought I detected a slight blush in her cheeks. Surely there have been women who would have been interested. It was my turn to feel uncomfortable. The truth was that there had been women over the years, respectable women. From town, the daughters of neighboring ranchers, even a school teacher from back east who'd come west looking for adventure. But none of them had ever felt right, never made me want to change my solitary existence. I suppose I never found anyone who understood what this life really means, I said slowly. Most women see a ranch as something to be civilized, domesticated. They want to plant flower gardens and hang curtains and turn the whole place into a parlor. They don't understand that the wildness is part of what makes it beautiful. And you think I understand? I looked at her, standing there in the morning light with dirt on her hands and the vast Arizona landscape stretching out behind her. And I knew with absolute certainty that she understood better than anyone I'd ever met. I think you understand that some things are worth preserving exactly as they are, I said. I think you know the difference between improving something and destroying it. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. My people have a saying, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. I think you understand this, even though you were not born knowing it. And I think you understand that a person can choose their family, their tribe, their place in the world, that blood and birth don't determine everything. We stood there looking at each other, and I felt something shift between us, some invisible barrier, falling away. For months, we'd been dancing around feelings that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge. But the pretense was becoming harder to maintain. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. We turned to see a group of riders, coming up the road to the ranch, 5 men in suits and badges, led by a figure I recognized with a sinking heart. Marshal Thompson, I said as the group reined in near where we stood. What brings you out to my ranch? Marshal Thompson was a federal officer, a man with the authority to enforce territorial law across the entire region. He was also, unfortunately, a close friend of Judge Whitmore and a firm believer in the government's policy of forcing Native Americans onto reservations. Mr. Cross, Thompson said, his voice cold and official. I'm here about the Apache woman. You're not harboring anyone, I replied calmly. Miss Aiyana is an employee of this ranch, working here under a legal arrangement approved by Judge Whitmore. That arrangement has been revoked, Thompson said, pulling a folded document from his coat. New orders from the territorial governor. All Apache individuals are to be relocated to designated reservations immediately. No exceptions. I felt my blood turn to ice. On what grounds? On the grounds that recent Apache raids in the southern part of the territory have made it clear that these people cannot be trusted to live peacefully among civilized populations. Aiyana has never been involved in any raids, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. She's been here, working on my ranch, for 3 months. That's irrelevant, Thompson replied. The order applies to all Apache individuals, regardless of their current circumstances. I looked at Aiyana, who had gone very still beside me. Her face was expressionless, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands had unconsciously clenched into fists. And if I refused to comply with this order, I asked, then you'll be arrested for harboring a fugitive and interfering with federal law enforcement. Your ranch will be confiscated, and you'll spend the next 5 years in territorial prison. The threat hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me: comply with an unjust law and lose the woman who had become the most important person in my life, or resist and lose everything I'd worked for, while probably failing to protect her. Anyway, how long do I have? I asked. You don't, Thompson said. The woman comes with us now. No. The word came out before I'd consciously decided to say it, but once it was spoken, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that I'd never experienced before. I beg your pardon, Thompson said, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. I said no. Aiyana is under my protection, and she's not going anywhere. Samuel, Aiyana said quietly, you can't. Yes, I can, I interrupted, not taking my eyes off the marshal. This is my land, and she's my employee. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through me. Thompson's face flushed red with anger. You're making a very serious mistake, Cross. Stand down, or I'll have you arrested right now. Then you'd better get started, I said, stepping protectively in front of Aiyana. For a moment, I thought Thompson might actually draw his weapon. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could hear the other deputies shifting nervously in their saddles. Then a new voice cut through the standoff. Marshal Thompson, I think there might be a legal issue with your orders. We all turned to see Dr. Webb riding up the road, accompanied by a man I didn't recognize, a well-dressed individual with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Dr. Webb, Thompson said through gritted teeth, this is a federal matter. It doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, the stranger said, dismounting and approaching our group. I'm Attorney General Harrison from the territorial capital. Dr. Webb sent word about this situation, and I came as quickly as I could. Thompson's face went pale. Sir, I was just following orders. Orders that may have been issued without proper legal authority. Harrison interrupted. The arrangement between Mr. Cross and Miss Aiyana was approved by a territorial judge and filed with the proper authorities. It cannot be simply revoked by executive order without due process. But the governor's directive? The governor's directive applies to Apache individuals living on public land or in government custody. Miss Aiyana is neither. She is a private citizen working under a legal contract on private property. I felt a surge of hope, but I tried not to let it show on my face. Legal technicalities could be argued either way, depending on who was doing the arguing. Furthermore, Harrison continued, I've been reviewing the circumstances of Miss Aiyana's original hearing. There are serious questions about whether proper procedures were followed, whether she had adequate representation, and whether the charges against her were substantiated. Thompson looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Are you saying the hearing was invalid? I'm saying it warrants review. Until that review is complete, Miss Aiyana's current status remains unchanged. The marshal glared at all of us, clearly frustrated by this unexpected turn of events. This isn't over, he said finally. I'll be back with clearer orders and more men if necessary. You do that? I replied calmly. But next time, make sure your orders are actually legal. Thompson and his men rode away in a cloud of dust and muttered curses, leaving the four of us standing in the sudden quiet of the ranch yard. Thank you, I said to Dr. Webb and Attorney General Harrison. Both of you, don't thank me yet, Harrison replied. I bought you time, not a permanent solution. The territorial government is under a lot of pressure to resolve the Apache problem, and they're not going to give up easily. What do you suggest? Harrison looked at Aiyana, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation. Miss B, do you have any documentation of your tribal affiliation, your family history, anything that might help establish your legal status? Aiyana shook her head. Everything was taken when I was brought to the town. My family's belongings, our papers, everything. That's unfortunate, but not insurmountable. There are other options. Harrison paused, looking between Aiyana and me with a speculative expression. Mr. Cross, what exactly is Miss Aiyana's status here? Employee ward, something else? I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I realized what he was getting at. She's worth what Samuel is trying to say, Aiyana said with a slight smile, is that we care for each other, more than either of us expected when this arrangement began. I see, Harrison said, and I could tell he was trying not to smile. Well, that does open up additional legal possibilities, such as marriage, Dr. Webb said bluntly. If Miss Aiyana were to marry a citizen of the territory, her legal status would change significantly. It would be much harder for the government to simply relocate her. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications and possibilities I'd been afraid to consider. I looked at Aiyana, trying to read her expression, wondering if the idea was as appealing to her as it suddenly seemed to me. It would have to be a real marriage, Harrison added, not just a legal fiction. The authorities would scrutinize it carefully. It would be real, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. If Aiyana is willing. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that made my heart race, not just affection or gratitude, but something deeper and more lasting. Yes, she said simply. I'm willing. Dr. Webb grinned. Well then, I think we have a solution. I can perform the ceremony right here, right now, if you'd like. I'm authorized to officiate marriages in the territory. And that's how, on a crisp October afternoon with the Arizona mountains as our witnesses, Aiyana and I were married under the vast desert sky. It wasn't the wedding either of us might have imagined, but it was perfect in its simplicity and honesty, as Dr. Webb pronounced us husband and wife. I realized that the townspeople had been wrong about everything. They'd called Aiyana unfit, but she'd proven to be the most capable person I'd ever known. They'd said I was making a mistake, but I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. They'd judged her by their narrow standards and found her wanting, but I'd seen her differently. From the very beginning, I'd seen her strength, her intelligence, her connection to the land and the animals we shared it with. I had seen her worth when others saw only difference. And now, as my wife, she would help me build something new on this land, not just a ranch, but a life that honored both our traditions while creating something uniquely our own. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and the woman they'd called unfit had found a place where she belonged completely. Together, we would prove that love and respect could bridge any divide, and that the judgment of others mattered far less than the truth we created together. As the sun set over our land, our home, I knew that this was just the beginning of our story. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they'd been searching for without even knowing it. The end. Author's note. This story explores themes of prejudice, cultural understanding, and the power of seeing beyond surface judgments to recognize the true worth of another person. Samuel and Aiyana's relationship develops from mutual respect and shared values, proving that love can transcend cultural boundaries when it's built on genuine understanding and appreciation for each other's strengths. Their story reflects the broader American experience of different cultures learning to coexist and create something new together.